and they'd be running, and the kids would come in and look at them, and they would be fascinated by them. Where's the cord? Where are the batteries? How does this thing work?
So these pieces that were made by these formidable people from the late 1700s till the turn of the century, they were wonderful pieces. Far more valuable than what's being produced today. Far more precise than what's being produced today. We can't let them cast away. We just can't.
Well, it's like any of the traditional art forms. There's less and less people doing it. There's less and less demand.
Well, it was quite by accident. I had gotten out of the Army and wanted to go to school. The only place to find work was Montgomery Ward's. The only job they had open was in the watch repair department. I told them I had absolutely no experience with that, and they said, well, go down and talk to them. I had gone to a technical high school in Baltimore City. I seemed to have a mechanical ability, so they asked me to do things at the shop, at the watch shop, and I did them. Struggled at first, but I did them, and they seemed pleased enough. Anyway, they hired me.
My wife has worked for the AWCI, or American Watchmakers Clockmakers Institute, for many years. 12, 13, maybe 14 years ago, they were starting a night class at American Watchmakers Clockmakers Institute. And she called one evening and said, would I be interested in attending classes and learning more about clockmaking? Of course, I said yes. She said, good, it starts tomorrow night. So they were looking for students.
The clock interest really came out of the woodworking, and it came late in life, the connection to the clocks itself. The woodworking came early. I mean, from the time I was a kid building birdhouses and model airplanes and things of that sort. But the clock making came really late.
My background was a machinist. I studied machining in high school and a trade school, and then pursued it in the military for about 10 years. This started out as a hobby that I picked up in England, going through some of the antique shops, just going through the little small villages and communities that are there. Just picked up American clocks that were shipped over there and started to admire them, and brought them back to my house and started working on them.
Okay, this is an Atmos clock. In here is a bellows that filled with a gas that is very sensitive to changes in temperature and pressure. And as the bellows moves in and out, it winds a small spring, and the small spring keeps the pendulum moving. So it's basically a perpetual motion clock. As long as the temperature and pressure change, the clock will run.
These are called dovetail joints, and they're still used today, but they really developed because the adhesives and the fastening mechanisms they had in the 17th and 18th century were not great, so you wanted to have a good mechanical bond because you couldn't just count on glue to hold things together. And I'll take one here and show you how I do that. I'll finish marking this up on where it's got to go, where my drill bit's got to go. That side and that side. So all of this has to go away, and all of this has to go away in a square manner, so that this piece here will fit into there snugly.
Normally I would come up here first, because I like to see what's happening at the dials before I get down and see what's happening at the movement. And it's easier to travel from up above and down below rather than do your servicing down below and then find a problem up above. So it's much easier to travel down, and it gives a good overview of what you need to accomplish.
tall case American clocks were from about Revolutionary War time through about the 1820s or 30s. That's when they were the most important thing in a well-to-do home. And they were very revered. They were very stylized. Then they lost popularity. They lost popularity when commercial clocks began to be mass-produced that would keep good time and were smaller and less expensive. And then they became popular again in the very late 19th century after the Civil War. The clockmaker who made the movement, which is really not visible to the outside, is really the way we identify who made the clock. Because he would have his mark on the movement. First off, he would have his stamped on the back right into the brass plate. He would have his maker's mark, and it might be his name, it might be his initials or something of that sort. And the cases were kind of random. They were styled by region, just like any furniture of that time. You know, Philadelphia everybody had claw and ball furniture, but Philadelphia had, you know, a certain configuration of the number of toes and the angles of the claw, different from that of Boston. And we saw this in the cases as well.
The clocks in the early part of this country were wooden works. We couldn't get brass from Britain. After the Revolution, and they seemed to be upset with us for some reason. And they wouldn't sell us brass. So we tried, so what do? You venture into industrial espionage. We went over there trying to steal their brass makers. We tried to smuggle brass makers out of England, but the only people who would go were the ones who were not very good at it. And a lot of money was invested in them. They produced very poor results. Because brass, as you know, is a combination of two metals, copper and zinc. The problem is homogenizing the copper and the zinc so that you get an even distribution throughout. That's very hard to do. It has to be done in a dark room, because in the 1700s and early 1800s, when they were trying to do this, there were no pyrometers, there were no thermometers that they could use to test the temperature of the metal. It all had to be done by eye. You had to judge the color of it as it was heating, as it was melting. Then you took a rod, steel rod, and you slowly poured in the zinc into the molten copper and stirred it. And the only way you had of determining how that mixture was being made or was homogenizing was the feel of the rod as it went through the molten copper. So it was an art form. And we didn't learn how to do it for close to 42 years.
The one big thing is the number of people that are in the field. The number of people are declining, and mainly through age, through attrition, through age. And the fact that there does not seem to be a big interest for new people coming into it.
Well, electronics is really what's come about for the Americans today. And we're more service-oriented than we are for manufacturing. And that's a sad thing to me. I think we need to go back into manufacturing and start producing some of our own pieces instead of depending on other countries to have that done. There's a child next door to us, a young man, that he was having a terrible time in school with just straight education. He just doesn't have the aptitude for it. And so they transitioned him over into a tech school, to a vocational school, and he's excelling. So it's just, to me, it's just not feasible for everyone to be college material. It's just not the way it is. Some people are just mechanically minded, and that works. It worked for me.
I think the schools are really committing a disservice to the young in that they have pretty much eliminated all shops, all industrial arts, so that working with your hands is considered just something that kids don't even it doesn't even come into their realm of possibility anymore. So they don't work with wood, they don't work with metal, they don't work with anything. It's all sitting at desks and doing, paperwork, intellectual work, yes. Some to a small extent with electronics, but very little. So as a result, they don't know what they can do and can't do. So how to generate an interest in something that they look at a clock like this, and to them it's magic. They don't understand how it works. They have no concept in the physics of it.
There's so many more ways for a person to entertain themselves today than there was 25, 30 years ago. When I was looking for a hobby, 25 years ago, there were so many choices. You look for a hobby today, there's an awful lot of choices. And the same thing with making a living. When you look at, your choices of making a living 30 years ago compared to how many choices you have now, there's more. So I think it gets diluted. With all of the mass production being done so inexpensively overseas and in China and everything, in places like that, and with all of the technology that they can use to imitate a style or a technique, it becomes very much more difficult for a traditional craft person to compete and be competitive. So you really have to find your market that really appreciates the old world style, but also appreciates the difference between something that is created against something that is just produced.